And I want to say hello to everybody watching us. And I see somebody in the background. Hello, Anne.
Hi. Yeah, Anne has decided
Hello,
to.
Anne. You weren't there a minute ago. Well, very good. I'm Netta Spencer. I'm here in Toronto, and I'm at my computer with a whole bunch of friends on the computer, and they fit in very nicely on the screen, and I'll introduce you to them. But first, I want to tell you about something that has happened in my life in the last few days. As you know, the reason I set this, some of you know, the reason I started doing these live streaming talk shows is to kind of bring people up to date about some of the issues that we would be discussing at the forum that I was organizing called How to Save the World in a Hurry. And that took place on Wednesday and Thursday of last week. And the purpose of the event was to create a list generated by the public, by people anywhere in the world, of things that could be done to reduce the risk of 6 global threats. That is war and weapons, especially nuclear, global warming, famine, pandemics, radiation exposure, like a Chernobyl accident or something, and cyber attacks. And we did so. And we have now a list of 25 called the Platform for Survival, which we're going to be putting on our website shortly, tomorrow maybe, I hope. And the website is called tosavetheworld.ca. And we hope that lots and lots and lots of people will want to go to that website and sign on as endorsers or signatories, sort of like being the signatory to a treaty. This is a civil society treaty where we're demanding of our governments and other public institutions, big public outfits, that they adopt some of these practices and uphold the policies that we have listed there. So I hope some of you will, not tonight, it's not ready, but tomorrow, go to tosavetheworld.ca and sign up, and then see if there's a way in which you can take that list of objectives and policies and get other people to be mindful of them. Because if we really work on promoting these ways of functioning in society, we will really reduce the risk of all 6 of these threats. So that's sort of what we have in mind. So now that I've done my little advertising pitch, I will introduce my friends. The first friend I'm going to introduce, it is a telephone inside a green circle on my screen. And I know that someplace in the world, there is a woman named Florence Stratton who is connected to that telephone, and she's going to say hello in a minute. Florence Stratton, I believe, is a retired English professor living in Regina. I don't know whether you were the University of Regina or where you taught, but at any rate, we'll find out a little bit more about you in a minute. And then next, at least on my screen right now, is Peter Venton. And Peter, say hello so that people can look
Hello.
at you. Say it louder.
Hello, everyone.
There you go. It brings you up. Brings you up. And I see his wife, Anne, in the background. Hello, Anne.
Yes.
Hi there.
Both Anne and I were at the CPRA Conference.
That's right. And I want to tell people that you're an economist, a retired economist. I think did you work at St. Michael's College at the university?
I'm a retired economist from the provincial government, where I was there as a senior economist for 25 years. But other part of my checkered career was being the bursar at the University of St. Michael's College in the University of Toronto.
Okay. And I think you get dragooned into being a treasurer for all kinds of organizations because none of the rest of us know how to manage money.
That's why it's so easy to get to be treasurer, because nobody wants to be one.
That's right. And Pugwash is one, in the Canadian Pugwash group, which I belong to. So thank you for being the treasurer and keeping us all honest. So then we have new friends who are in Saskatoon. And one is Chris Hyrnkow, who is a professor of religious studies, I believe, at St. Thomas More College. And he's been attending, along with Peter and Anne. They've been at a conference in Regina of the Canadian Peace Research Association. And that's really the first thing I want to start off talking about. But first, let me introduce a friend of his that I think he just found you out in the hallway or something. And
I was at the swimming pool.
A swimming pool with your children, was it?
Yes.
Swimming, and he went and got you. Well, that's great, because the more the merrier for these conversations. And this woman is Susana Barnes, who has a PhD in anthropology and is an adjunct professor where?
The University of Saskatchewan.
Saskatchewan, very good. And that's in Saskatoon too. Hmm?
Yes.
I drove through the prairies once. That's, how much I remember of where things are. I'm afraid it's not much. But at any rate, Susana has a history of living in East Timor and of doing humanitarian work there and peace work. So we'll ask her to tell us in a bit about her experience in East Timor. So thank you for bringing her out of the swimming pool into your office and so on, Chris. Now then, I couldn't go to Regina the last little while when you guys were out there having your wonderful conference, because I was busy with this thing here in Toronto, this How to Save the World in a Hurry. Therefore, I need to be brought up to date on what I missed. And since not Susana, but the rest of you were there for, what is it, about a 3-day conference, was it?
Yes, 3 days.
Sounds like a lengthier and fuller conference than some of the others I've attended. So let's start off. Since Peter is the treasurer of the organization, do you mind, Peter, giving us your impression of what went on there? Was it a good conference, and did you like it? And if so, why?
Okay, well, I thought this is one of the best CPRA conferences that I have attended over the last 5 or 6 years. The bonus at this conference this year was we had 2 big thinkers at the Congress. The first of whom was Margaret McMillan, who talked about thinking about war.
Oh.
And the other one was Marie Wilson, Commissioner Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
For Canada?
Now, these were not CPRA, as they were the larger Congress series of big thinking, or a big thinking series. But anyway, to the CPR presentations, I thought there was a marvelous degree of interdisciplinary aspects to the presentations. I particularly liked Chuck Thiessen and Bren and Sean Byrne, of the University of Manitoba, on a topic that they called Proceed with Caution, Research, Production, and Uptake in Conflict Affected Countries. And what this is about, that there's a lot of biased research on globalization, on the issue of globalization on developing countries. It's producing divergent results, which allow decision and policymakers in violence-affected contexts to conveniently select and interpret research results according to their particular interests or the interests of the organizations that they represent. And then,
is he talking about government officials or?
No, he's talking about academics.
Mm-hmm. And you mean to say there are academics who are biased?
Yes. Which is why there's very little resolution on the causal relationships between globalization and poverty and the degradation of the environment.
So that people are just cheating in their research.
And world poverty in particular. So there are some of the neoliberals and the developed countries that point to the increase or the reduction in world poverty as a consequence of all of the increased trade and international investment that is a feature of neoliberal capitalism, and is also. I think the interesting thing is globalization of the 20th century is quite a bit different than globalization of the 19th century. The latter, of course, led to the First World War.
In what way? In what sense?
Essentially, globalization is a combination of four things: huge increases in international trade, very large increases in the liberalization of investment among countries, large degree of inter-country migration, and a tremendous increase in the communications by individuals and governments around the world. Of course, the 20th century phenomenon of globalization is significantly different in that the inter-country migration is greatly reduced because borders are to a large extent closed. But the globalization is essentially a phenomenon of the high development of a capitalist system, where there gets to be excess production relative to demand, and so there's constant pressure to increase production through foreign trade because markets are insufficient in the domestic market. So it's an overextended capitalist system, and this is the phenomenon. But a lot of the international trade is what Galton would describe as featuring structural violence. The United States, for example, is a huge economic empire that is involved in just about every country of the world, both economically and to a degree militarily. This aggression is at the expense of the sovereignty of many other nation states.
Okay, so but these guys are saying that there are academics who are doing biased research because they have some interests in denying the ill effects of globalization, or what?
Yeah, they have an interest in supporting the concept or the efficacy of capitalism worldwide, even though it is creating all kinds of problems of inequity, both in developed countries and also in less developed countries. And these are not considered to be peaceful developments. They certainly are not democratic in the sense that there's a loss or an increase in the distribution of wealth is essentially in contrast to the concept of democracy, which contemplates a more equal distribution of wealth and authority.
I mean, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was my first time at such a conference, and I thought, I enjoyed or appreciated a number of things, particularly the link that was made between war and global warming. But I didn't attend every session, so there may have been something along this line. But I think there needs to be a link between war and colonialism. And is globalization simply another word for classic colonialism, where we're fighting wars in order to get, or committing acts of aggression in order to get our hands on other people's resources? And we're doing it both internationally and nationally.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's very true. The United States I position it as a very large economic empire, and also it's managed essentially by a combination of oligarchs and military types. The even more worrisome part is that China, which has for 5,000 years tended to be a relatively self-sufficient political jurisdiction, has now adopted the capitalist market system, which requires, and it is adopting essentially a United States economic system of technology and production. The problem is that we are now in the Earth, we're running at 1.6 Earths a year on the planet. That is to say, we're taking about 60% more out of the ecological balance than is there. China, in order to achieve the kind of economic outcomes similar to that of the United States, we will require the equivalent of 3 planet Earths in terms of resources. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge amount of aggression, economic aggression in countries from China, as well as the United States, to get the resources that they need to operate an economy.
And Canada is doing it too, with our mines everywhere. We've got more, we own more mining companies around the world than any other country. So it's not just the United States and China, we're in there as well. Plus we support all U.S. policies, or most U.S. policies, so that we've got a lot of work to do here too.
She's breaking up. But
let me turn to Chris, because Chris, you went to the same conference. Did you touch a different part of the elephant, or did you see and hear pretty much the same orientation, a concern about the effects of global capitalism, including the Chinese version of communism, which is, of course, really capitalism nowadays? Is that the kind of thing that you were hearing, or what were some of the papers and conversations that you ran into?
Sure. So yeah, that's definitely was one of the themes, but I guess there's a lot of interrelated themes or different parts of the elephant, as you're saying. So to maybe start where Peter started, I was able to go to a couple of the big thinking events as well. Not the same ones that Peter was able to go to, but I went, which I know Florence also went to hear Wyona LeDuc speak. And that was quite powerful to me. So if you can't see, but on the bookshelf behind there, I have a number of her books.
I have to admit, I don't know who she is. I've heard that name, but I don't even know anything about her. Who is she?
Oh, sure. So she's from she's an Indigenous activist in the United States. Who's trained in minor. That's actually a good question, but I'm pretty sure she's trained in philosophy, but it might be cultural philosophy, and so maybe anthropology, but I'm quite sure it's philosophy. But she's from White Earth in Minnesota, and she's been working on a number of issues, which she spoke about with great power, echoing the point that Florence just raised, was the role of Canada as a petrostate, a situation whereby we assume that we're not involved in these things, that we assume that we're in a good place, but we have these own complicity. So Florence, I don't know if you want to say anything more about that particular event that you were also at.
Yeah, I mean, it was, as you say, very powerful, and the whole history of clearing the plains, which started with the extermination of the buffalo, and then the starvation policy by John A. Macdonald against Indigenous people to force them on reserves, and thousands died. And now we're still clearing the plains. I mean, we're abducting their children and putting them in social welfare. We're we've got more Indigenous people in prison in Saskatchewan, like it's 90% of our prisoners. So we continue to clear the plains in order to get access to Indigenous land.
Mm-hmm.
So one of my friends who was there didn't pay their Congress registration fees for this big conference, and they said this is part of unsettling the plains. Indigenous activists, and that they deserve the right to access this knowledge instead of paying to be on Treaty 4 land, which was kind of an
that Line 3, which Winona Leduc was talking about, runs just south of Regina and then on to Minnesota. And it looks like Minnesota has very effective resistance to it. We are trying to mount some resistance in Regina, and I hope we will succeed there too. But it's running through Indigenous territory all the way, and it's there's obviously possible spills. There's climate change. There's the earth and the climate to worry about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, can I shift a little bit over to Susana, because you did not go to the conference, but you probably had a full and rich life nevertheless, right there in your hometown with your swimming pool and your children. So tell me about your own history a little bit. I understand that you were working for the Jesuit refugee camp or something in East Timor shortly after it became Timor-Leste, is that it?
That's correct.
The new independent country. Tell me what that was about.
Sure. In fact, listening to the other people here today, it's very interesting, this link between war, extractive industries, and also diplomacy, soft diplomacy, hard diplomacy, and trade, because these all come to play in East Timor. East Timor was a former Portuguese colony. It was colonized for over 400 years by the Portuguese, who held on to it, and it was really a prison colony for them. And when the Indonesians under Suharto invaded, taking advantage of the Carnation Revolution in Portugal in 1974, they invaded East Timor and were very keen to keep hold of it, mainly because of the oil reserves that fall within the maritime boundaries of East Timor, of Portuguese Timor at that time. And as I'm not sure whether you will be aware, but Australia and Indonesia signed a very lucrative agreement about the exploitation of the oil resources within the Timor Sea and the Timor Gap. And this has been a major issue for Timor-Leste since independence in its relationship with Australia. And they have just successfully been able to renegotiate a treaty with Australia that was hastily sort of put together during the United Nations Transitional Administration. And really, they've been pushing for a clear delimitation of the boundaries with Australia. Australia was very keen to keep a former boundary and to also maintain the extraction of the oil on Australian soil. And Timor has been very much pushing towards getting a clear delimitation of their maritime boundary. It's an issue of sovereignty for them, and also pushing for a lot more development to happen onshore in Timor or within Timor Sea. But I'm not an expert on that, so I won't talk about that in particular. But yes, this continues to be an issue for its international relations, for Timor-Leste's international relations with Indonesia, with Australia, but also China. And China has been extremely influential in post-independence Timor-Leste, doing a very sort of soft diplomacy approach, providing a lot of funding for large infrastructure programs. Interestingly, a lot of these programs, including the national electricity grid, are not only funded by the Chinese government, but built by Chinese workers who are brought in to undertake the projects. And there's a great East Timorese researcher, Mika Barreto Suarez, who's been working on these Chinese Timor-Leste relationship. Now, China was one of the few countries that sort of maintained a very close relationship with East Timor during the occupation. And so there is an ongoing relationship there with Timor-Leste. But yes, I became involved in Timor a few months after the UN-sponsored ballot in 1999, in which East Timorese people were asked on the ballot form whether they wish to remain as part of an autonomous region within Indonesia, or whether they desired a full independence or another solution. And so 78.5% of the population voted in favor of independence, of not being part of an autonomous region within Indonesia. And what had been basically months and months of sort of low-level violence, but pointed explosive moments during the campaign, broke out into a violent, scorched earth military campaign of retreat from East Timor. So Indonesian troops, as they left the country, they basically burnt all the infrastructure that the Indonesian administration had established during the 25 years of occupation. Through their proxy militias, they targeted independence supporters, burnt also many private houses, detained, murdered, raped, and pillaged many communities on their way out. They also forcibly displaced hundreds of thousands of people. And this was a very, very well organized forced displacement. The Indonesian military and Indonesian militias had organized for trucks to be available immediately after the ballot, to put people on these trucks and take them to refugee camps in West Timor that had been set up specifically for this reason. And the idea was that they would be able to claim that people under duress had voted against being part of the autonomous region. Cut a short story short, I came to East Timor in January 2000, so 4 months after these events. The vast majority of people who had been taken to West Timor had managed to return, and the estimates were that 250,000 people were across the border. By the end of December, perhaps 180,000 had returned, but there was still a considerable amount of people in refugee camps. Now, those people were unable to return, many because they were being held coercively. Camps, when I visited, or even in January 2000, were controlled by militia groups, armed militia groups. The Indonesian military and Indonesian police were sort of...
Excuse me, I want to get clear in your head. You've got these camps, refugee camps in East Timor.
In West Timor.
West Timor, where there are the East Timorese kept and they can't go back. They want to go back to East Timor.
Correct.
And why? Why can't they?
Because they're being held by the militia. There are many reasons. Partly, there's those who are coercively kept in the camps. They're surrounded by people who are armed, the armed militia. There are those who were taken to the camps and don't know how to get back home. There are those who are afraid because they may have been involved in some violence in East Timor during the campaign, during the build-up to the UN-sponsored ballot. There are those who may have not been involved in violence, but were politically sympathetic to the Indonesians, who may have supported autonomy within the Indonesian state. So there are many reasons why those people don't want to come back. But the vast majority, and I was working with the Jesuit refugee service at the time, the vast majority of people we were talking about were simple farmers who had been taken from their remote communities, loaded on trucks and taken across the border. And it was a question of just wanting to get back and knowing what they were going back to, because they had left seeing everything being burnt to the ground, people being killed, families being separated. So there was a lot of fear and uncertainty about the return. So part of our work with the Jesuit Refugee Service at that time was helping open lines of communication between families in East Timor and families still in the camps in West Timor. And the way we did this, well, we started a postal service, was our first one, was to exchange letters, to take letters from communities within East Timor and take them to their relatives in West Timor so that they could send photos. Or remember, this is 2000, so the internet and the mobile network is not that great yet. So things may have been very different had those things been as developed as they are now. And 250,000 people in East Timor today are on Facebook. So to give you an idea of what it's like.
And I first heard about East Timor through Noam Chomsky, who took up the cause.
Of course, yes, and he was one of the greatest and continues to be one of the greatest supporters of East Timor independence, and also East Timor's struggle in terms of its natural resources as well.
Right, yeah. I guess I was wondering what folks thought about the link between peace research and peace activism. I mean, some of you, I mean, I used to be at the university, but is there a link within the university between peace research and peace activism?
Chris, perhaps you're best.
Chris,
yeah, so
your bailiwick. Give us a pitch.
The pitch, sure. So I think, so we're going through, so I should start by saying that I'm trained in peace and conflict studies. So I was one of the first students to go through the Morrow Center program, the Morrow Center for Peace and Justice at the University of Manitoba, which started with a PhD program. And I also taught in the two other programs in Winnipeg, Peace and Conflict Transformation Studies at the Canadian Mennonite University, although I'm Catholic myself, and also at Conflict Resolution Studies at Meadow Simons College. And one of the things that drew me to the field in the first place was this idea that you could be sort of critically normative, meaning that you're careful, reflective about the commitments you take, but then there's a role for academics in supporting community, peace activism, etc., and that can be a confluence and a mutually enhancing sort of relationship. So we're in the process right now of trying to start a peace studies program. We have the academic permissions, etc., at our college here at St. Thomas More College at the University of Saskatchewan. And it's arguing for a different paradigm because we want to bring in the community groups. We want to, our ambition is to actually even start a center where part of the work of the center would be as a resource for community groups to help them with things that academics can maybe help them with, things like drafting funding proposals, writing literature for their campaigns, getting keen and excited and capable students to mount social media campaigns, things like that, and to act as sort of a facilitation. So it's truly community engaged research, which the University of Saskatchewan was meant to be founded upon.
Okay, that sounds excellent. Yeah,
Yes, it does.
I think also coming back to Peter's talk about that discussion about the talk that he went to and about bias in academia.
Yeah.
I think here is, I think especially with research concerning globalization, we have research happening on many different levels, and often it isn't the voice from bottom up that we're hearing. We're often, from an economist perspective, we're talking in numbers and looking at large spreadsheets and looking at figures, and without real appreciation of what that translates to in terms of the lives of people on the ground. And I think that that's also an important role that academics can play, especially within the social sciences, within disciplines such as anthropology, like my own, is to sort of, if we've got a very one-sided perspective coming from a sort of top-down view of globalization, it's to bring up the bottom-up perspective.
Yeah, and then I think, and the academy is a real battleground for this, because if you just leave it alone, those corporate globalized interests are very happy to take up those spaces. So maybe this is one of the things that appealed about Chuck and Sean's paper to Peter, was naming that bias, and maybe countering it with this bias that's for the people, for sustainability, for peace, for community engagement, for participation, etc. So if you looked, you can't see out our window, but if you looked out our window where it says Cameco, which is one of the big extractive industry companies in Saskatchewan, a nuclear mining company. For a long time, Saskatchewan was the #1 producer of uranium in the world. That company that mines it, Cameco, employs a number of my neighbors, but they also have a very strong relationship with the university now in this current climate. So the welcome space for the university is called the Cameco Welcome Plaza. And a lot of my Indigenous friends have real problems with that because of the effects that the uranium mining has had in northern Saskatchewan and particularly on Indigenous communities. Peter Preble, who was one of the speakers at the conference, he and I were talking at lunch about that a couple of years ago. There was an ad at the University of Saskatchewan asking for someone to do research on views on nuclear energy in Saskatchewan, even though we don't have a nuclear facility to generate energy ourselves. It was kind of an interesting project, and the ad was written in such a way that it was clear that they were looking for people to come to conclusions that showed everyone had positive views of nuclear energy. That leaves out these stories on the margins, and I think what appeals to me about peace studies and about like the type of anthropological research that Susana does is it gets to those communities and can maybe share voice, bring voice in different ways forward, and I think that sort of justifies this academic enterprise, in my view.
There was a very interesting presentation by Sean Byrne and Stan Amiladis on combining principles of leadership with peace and conflict studies, picking up on Peter Sengi's learning organization, but that would seem to also involve a link between the academic and the activist groups. And I think Hauser also had a story on organizing civil society groups in Winnipeg about the discrimination against or the racism, I guess, against Indigenous. And there were some really interesting academic perspectives that he had on leadership and defining purpose and organization that the civil society organizations, especially the faith-based ones, really could help or be helped with.
Would somebody elaborate on the connection between uranium mining and the Indigenous people? Were they unduly or unusually involved in the mining business themselves, or is it? What is their?
The mining is taking place in the north of Saskatchewan, where many Indigenous communities are, and it's laying waste to the land and the water.
Mm-hmm. And is it still going on?
Oh yes,
yeah.
Uranium mining is a big deal in Saskatchewan, and Cameco pours its money into all kinds of things, corrupting them along the way, I'm afraid.
Does this stuff get exported, or what? Is it
we supposedly only export it to countries who aren't going to use it in bombs, but we export it to the U.S., to India, to all kinds of places.
Okay, and
this is something I just like to say. This is something that a lot of Canadians aren't aware of. That we have this extractive industry that's leaving behind these wastes, but also that's exporting uranium all around the world. And as Florence is saying, there's this commitment where it's not going to be used for weaponry, but there's not real checks and balances to follow through the life of the uranium after it's exported. And it's huge business in Saskatchewan, huge business. So.
And it's a major part of the economy then.
Pardon me, it's
it's significant. A lot of people there are actually involved in the uranium mining. I don't know. I guess, of course, I knew this, but I didn't know. I guess I don't know the proportions. I'm sort of. I guess I had the idea that there's a little bit of uranium mining still going on, but sounds like you're talking about it as still a very big problem.
It's still the second or third, depending on how you do the accounting, it's the second or third largest source of uranium in the world. And the problem is, when we're talking about bringing in voices from the margins, all of this is the mining itself is going on in the periphery, and the head office, for instance, of Cameco is in Saskatoon, which maybe from a Toronto perspective isn't a major center, but from a Saskatchewan perspective, this is really interesting because all the harms are displaced to the margins, and all the benefits are at the center. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if this is your experience, Susana, but I know when I go down my street, I know the people that work for Cameco, right? So it's a very good example of how what we were talking about with Wyona Leduc's lecture is that we're involved in all these things that Peter named as structural violence following Galtung, and we're complicit in them, and it's our neighbors and our friends and ourselves. And if we want to build peace, when you have this big conception of peace that includes sustainability, that includes this grassroots element of cultures, etc., that's setting a very big task for what counts as peace building in our society. Mm-hmm. So the nuclear is a perfect example of how big that is. Right down to the point where Florence and mine salary is paid in part by the taxes that the government gets from these extractive industries. So we're really complicit in it.
Mm-hmm. I don't know how it is in Canada, so maybe you can enlighten me, but I did my PhD in Australia, and I've been based in Australia for the last 10 years, and obviously uranium mining and the extractive industry in general is the foundation of Australia's economy. And most of the uranium is also in the north and the central, and this is the many indigenous communities. But the way that mining companies have had to deal with this, and the Australian government is entering into agreements with indigenous communities and corporations, the mining company and the Australian government. And this has created a whole level of complexity, but I don't know whether in Canada you have the same direct negotiation with indigenous communities. So in certain areas, in Australia, the mining company deals directly with the indigenous communities. It pays revenue to the indigenous community and has to provide certain services and employment to the indigenous community. And it has been controversial, this issue about how those negotiations take place, who gets a say, and then the relationship with the state.
Yeah.
But now it's also true then that in Australia, the indigenous people are unusually or disproportionately involved in the mining?
Well, the uranium happens to be located in areas that are in large areas that are on indigenous lands, and so they have to deal with the indigenous corporations that also have control over that land. Yeah. And yes, so we don't have. I'm not, again, this is not my area of expertise, but we have the same issues with water, especially water management, water pollution, but also water, climate change related issues with water in Australia, which are also linked to these mining.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I suspect it's the same in Australia and Canada because of colonial policies.
Exactly.
Indigenous communities are very, very poor. And so any kind of employment is, well, generally welcome, although there has been some resistance to Cameco. And what Cameco offers are the lowest level jobs. You won't find any indigenous person in a high executive position in Cameco. They're just lowly workers being paid a pittance, but a pittance is better than nothing. And because of colonial policies, you know, there's terrible poverty on First Nations and, well, across the country.
Mm-hmm.
And I can speak to that a little too. So from the activist perspectives, so the I Don't Know More movement started in Saskatoon. A lot of those women that started that movement, including Sylvia McAdam, Erica Violet.
Yeah. Right.
They've been very. Cameco has been one of their major concerns. Erica, Violet, Lee, and myself, we worked with a group of other students and a couple of staff here to try to get our college to divest from not only fossil fuels, but also uranium. And the college was willing, when we went through this process, which I talked about at a CPRA conference a couple of years ago, they were willing to say that we'll only invest in socially and ecologically beneficial enterprises as much as possible, which is interesting language. But Erica was very keen that they exclude Cameco and tar sands oil because of the effects that they have on Indigenous communities. And they weren't willing to make that exclusion, perhaps for fear of how that would play out in the media. As it was, that wasn't picked up as a story at all. But the point is that the Cameco jobs, even in the mining jobs, most of them are people that are commuting in, or they're settlers working in the mines, so not Indigenous people working in the mines. And so even those low-level jobs are disproportionately not going to Indigenous people. And then there's a whole activist community of people who identify as water protectors that are hyperly concerned for very, very good reasons about the long-lasting effects of this extraction and what it means in terms of the land and the health of the land. And Sylvia McAdam will talk about being a water protector and being concerned for people, for things that maybe Cameco thinks of as resources and she thinks of as her kin, right? So it's a different philosophy that you can, if you go on YouTube, you can hear her speaking about. I won't want to claim her voice. She does it very, very well.
Do you feel, as a peace studies professor, that you are in any way kind of recruiting young people into an activist life? Or do you keep a professorial detachment when you're lecturing and not get on your soapbox about your particular causes that you're trying to? I mean, do you ever say, "Come on, march with me," for example? Would you ever tell students, "Come on, let's make some placards and go for a demonstration"?
I have the reverse situation where they invite you because of what you're talking about. They say, if you take this seriously, what you've talked about in the classroom, you should be here on Saturday, or you should be there on Sunday, or be here on Tuesday night. And I think the students that take the classes that are we don't have a peace studies program proper yet, but we have a social justice and the common good program. I teach courses like religion and nonviolence. I see them as really driving and being more authentic than I am, for instance.
Really? Your students, when the young ones, when they arrive, they're already
yeah. A very good example is so I was saying that we're going before we went on air. I was saying that next week we're going to this curriculum development workshop at Notre Dame University to start our peace studies program. We have a very complicated course challenge system where different professors can object. So we're really interested to get everything as academically rigorous as possible to pass those different hurdles. Normally that would be just for faculty. And I made the argument to the organizer at Notre Dame, and already someone else from Venezuela had made that argument that same year, is that we can't develop an authentic undergraduate program without having undergraduate students involved. And once he was willing to make that concession, the problem wasn't, oh, who do we get? It's which one of these students can we pick? Because the students are much more engaged and interested than most of the faculty would be.
I mean, I think in the case of East Timor, the relationship between academics, civil society, church, peace activists was one of the driving forces behind really pushing until finally a UN ballot was agreed upon between Indonesia, Portugal, and the United Nations. And it continues to be a great source of activism around issues affecting East Timor. And many activists have now turned academics, and many activists and academics have now, especially East Timorese, have become involved politically within the government or within international organizations working in East Timor. So I think it is a very productive sort of relationship that there can be between academia, civil society.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that gives me hope, because I think there certainly are waves when you look at student populations. Sometimes they're very complacent and sometimes much more close to being, out protesting all the time. And I don't.
In my experience, students are really interested in things that make sense to them, and so much of our education really doesn't make any sense at all. And they're also interested in justice. So if you're dealing with, if you are explaining things in a way that makes sense to them, and you're dealing with issues of justice, they sit up and they're very alert. At least that was my experience.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And they have ideas because it's their future, right? Mm-hmm. And in a lot of ways, we're passing on to them something that's very, very flawed, and they have hope and aspiration and technique and energy to change that situation. So. Mm-hmm.
Well, there is a variation from one period to another. And for example, I just was talking to Doug Roach about this, and a year or two ago, he made a little more than a year ago, but he made a big trip to talk about nuclear weapons to university students all over the place. And he was rather disappointed, to put it mildly, that he found most of the students then were extremely unaware of the dangers of nuclear weapons. And I have found very much the same thing. I taught a course for several years, 4 or 5 years, on public health as in the nuclear age, where I talk about nuclear power and about nuclear weapons. And people, usually the students said, "Oh, I didn't know that. I hadn't heard that." They weren't resisting it. It's just really they hadn't heard it. Now, it may be that right now there's a resurgence of interest in and concern about nuclear weapons because of all of these daring exchanges between Trump and his counterpart, the little rocket man, or whatever you want to call him, in North Korea. But and it seems to go up and down quite a lot. But I wonder if you have noticed a growth in interest and concern about nuclear weapons among the students that in the last year, let's say, have the students become more cognizant of the dangers? What's happening?
Yeah, I don't know. I think they care about that. And it's part, I think this is why, actually, to just rewind a little bit, I think this is why the peace studies is so important, is that it's just one of many issues that points towards a structurally violent society. And that's a particularly poignant and sharp one. And Trump has been a bit of a wake-up call for a lot of students, because you see who has their hand on the button matters, right? He makes that very evident.
I think I agree that nuclear weapons are a terrible threat, but there are so many horrible things that are actually happening that I'm almost inclined to put my energy there rather than in some threat. There's the growing gap between rich and poor, there's terrible poverty and suffering, and all of this kind of violence that we've been talking about. So that's where I would tend to put my focus, although, yes, I am concerned to some degree, but let's stop the violence that's already happening.
Florence, perhaps also in relation to what you said earlier about colonialism, I think here, which is another important part of peace studies, is the historical dimension and importance of bringing history and understanding the history of colonialism and teaching that in our schools, not only in our universities, but teaching it at the school level to get kids to understand what colonialism is, how it's reflected in what the East Timorese would call neo-colonialism, how even, under the guise of peace, it's a neo-colonial project. In relation to East Timor, here again, the lessons of history are very strong. The Japanese briefly occupied Timor between 1942, I think, to 1944. And they have been extreme. The peace activists in Japan have been lobbying very hard, lobbied during the Indonesian occupation, and continue to work with peace activists in East Timor. They bring the peace boat once every few years to East Timor, teaching the histories, the lessons from history that they have learned, also following up the history of comfort women, for example, in East Timor. So I think the historical dimension is really important.
Yeah. And we have these like these basic issues that are all interconnected. So we talked about how the nuclear industry in Saskatchewan marginalizes Indigenous people. We had these things that were called the Starlight Tours in Saskatoon, where Indigenous people who were inebriated were taken out of the city and told to walk it off and come back in, and people died doing that. And this stuff happens. If you went to one of the bigger buildings in campus, you could see the area where they were dropped off by the Queen Elizabeth Power Station, right? So there's these. It's the thing with the nuclear weapons is it sometimes seems far away to people, but it's still a point of reflection that ties into these other issues and this general concern for peace that I think the students are really able to transfer into action in a way that my generation wasn't able to, at least the students that I see. I was teaching religions and nonviolence when the Trump administration announced that they had $1 trillion to upgrade the nuclear arsenal. And all of those students had an idea of something different you could do with $1 trillion to build a more peaceful society. And I think that basic point is really active amongst the younger people. So.
Thank you. This has been to me, refreshing and encouraging, because you're all so beautiful and you're speaking of really wonderful, beautiful changes that I like to know about. I haven't been out your way for a long time, but I think you must have a real center of peace studies on the prairies, right? And it seems to me you have more of that kind of thing maybe than we do here in Toronto. Anyway, thank you very much, and thank Peter Venton, who's got your phone still, I guess, up, and also Florence, who is still. I haven't seen you. You're still just a green circle with a telephone on it, and someday you're going to have to send me a photo or something so we can attach it to your video here. And make you.
We could become Facebook friends.
All right, we indeed can do that. And
I guess, yeah.
Yes.
If I could just say one thing that I know that Florence is working on in Regina that I was quite excited to hear about is your point that it has to be at all levels. So in Regina, they're working to get peace studies into the schools, the grade schools, which I think is really important.
Excellent.
Yeah, we're just getting started on that campaign, and we're hoping that Saskatoon will join us too. So
yes.
Listen, you guys keep me posted on that, because I run Peace Magazine, and I like to have stories about what's going on in the rest of Canada. So I'd like to know how things are going, and a little bit more if you want to send me some information about the various institutions of higher education on the prairies where you are all studying peace studies at universities and colleges. This Moro Institute is a word that I've heard in the last couple of days but had not been familiar with. I suppose it must have happened since I retired 20 years ago. Thank you all. So, good night.
Thank you. Good night.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.